So, reiterating what Andrew said, thanks for spending your Sunday morning with us, especially during football season. This panel is the Jewish Writers Committee's inaugural educational panel, and it has been a year in the making, which should not be a surprise to any Jews on this Zoom. But I wanted to thank you all for attending and for everyone who helped put this together. It really takes a village. And now I'll hand it over to my co-chair for this event and our moderator. This panel would definitely not have happened without her, Laura Shapiro.
Hi, thank you, David. Thank you so much. In this past year of working with you on this project, we've gone through a lot of changes, but what has remained constant is that you're a delight to work with, and I'm so glad we had a chance to work together on this. I'm going to jump right in. When I started my background research for this project oh so long ago, literally the first website that came up was Molly Adams' Jewish Horror Review, which is exactly on point. Molly is a writer and film critic from the UK whose work has appeared at In Review Online, Filmotomy, and Jewthink. She specializes in Jewish horror across film, theater, and literature. Her website started as a home for her master's dissertation entitled Jewish Horror Defining a New Subgenre, and then grew into something of an obsession. Now she's trying to catalog and write about as many novels, films, and plays as possible. Molly, I'm excited to talk to you about both the history and the present state of Jewish horror. You really are the perfect person to begin this discussion. Can you please give us an overview of the influences of Jewish horror on early film?
So other than folklore and obviously the theological influences on Jewish horror, it really starts with German Expressionism. Paul Wegener's early films, there was a Golem trilogy that he wrote, of which one I think survives nowadays, called Der Golem. And then you've got other works like F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu and things like that that really give us an idea of these twin lines running through Weimar cinema, which was German Expressionism that gave a lot of Jewish creators an outlet to really do some incredible and really influential artistic work. And then this other sinister vein of anti-Semitism that we see in works like Murnau's Nosferatu. And that's really sort of where Jewish horror started, with that paradoxical pre-World War II artistic movement of German Expressionism.
That's fascinating. We've all seen those films, but maybe not analyzed those elements of them. You, in your master's, you do a case study of Rosemary's Baby, which brings us into the more modern era of horror. It brings up a very interesting meta-analysis of the role of Jewish writers, not just in horror, but in any genre. Rosemary's Baby is a classic, hugely influential horror film, which was based on the novel written by Ira Levin, a Jewish author, and adapted for screen and directed by Roman Polanski, a Jewish Holocaust survivor. It is on the surface a story with Christian horror tropes, but you analyze it through the lens of the concept of Jewish writers in Catholic drag. And the film also used common cinematic depictions of witchcraft, which are rife with anti-Semitic tropes. Let's talk about Jewish writers using Catholic drag as both a satirical device and a safe way of examining Jewish horror themes, and the way the film used anti-Semitism in the context of horror.
So where the notion of Catholic drag really started was with a UK academic, Dr. Michael Coven, who has this notion of Jewish drag within horror, which was nominally Christian writers or writers from a Christian perspective who were using Judaism almost to prop up Christian theology and Christian values in their work. So he points to The Exorcist 3, to The Seventh Seal, I believe it's called, and other films like that that use things like Jewish eschatology, not to actually tell Jewish stories, but just to prop up. I'm so sorry, my cat.
That's okay. We welcome feline participation.
Yeah, and so Dr. Coven writes a lot about Jewish drag. And I wanted to really invert that notion and make it something a bit more subversive, I suppose. And so Rosemary's Baby is a really perfect example, especially with Levin's work as a satirist. He's able to really poke fun at the hegemonic Christian values of horror, pretty much by I'm so sorry about this. Um, yeah, sorry, let me just find my notes really quickly.
Yes.
But yes, Levin is doing a lot of things in Rosemary's Baby. He's using uh, his use of Catholic drag basically to point at the othering that Rosemary goes through. So Rosemary in the novel, especially, she is othered by her family for her religion and for her Catholicism. And then she sees it almost as acceptable to other her neighbors who are very highly and very strongly Jewish coded. Um, with Catholic drag, it sort of allows for satire, even in films that would normally flinch away from criticizing Christianity. In Rosemary's Baby, one of the big ways that he does it is to have these grandiose rituals that really resemble Catholicism more than anything. And to really find the sinister heart of those is something that I find quite interesting. It's allowing a sort of Trojan horse within horror films of not pointing out a specifically non-Christian vein, so to speak, but to really subvert it in a way that I find quite interesting.
It's also interesting that Rosemary's Baby was a film that was made at a time when the concept of Satanism was changing from a response to Catholicism to something broader.
Yeah.
In the actual culture. And so it makes it, there's also a commentary there, I think, as well, because that was something that Polanski knew about and
Definitely.
was to some degree involved with.
I think it's Chuck Palahniuk writes some really interesting things about where Levin and Polanski creating both the novel and the film, was that we were really living in a time where it was the idea that science had won and the idea that religion was a relic of the past that we would never really go back to. And yet we had just, I think, 15 to 20 years divorced from the Holocaust and from World War II, which had proven that, you know, religion was one of the most important things and that so many people would divide the world along these lines still.
Yeah, well, and with Polanski's very specific personal background as a child refugee in the Holocaust, he brought all of that to his work. I wanted to move on to the horror tropes that carry anti-Semitic messages in vampire stories, and particularly in its relation to the blood libel. Vampires are so ubiquitous in filmmaking. There's one vampire story after another, and there's a lot of Catholic drag within that as well. And there also are anti-Semitic tropes, which you touched on a bit, mentioning Nosferatu earlier. Could you expound upon that a little bit for us and how we can find ways in our writing, if we are writing vampire stories, to avoid
that? So with vampires, there is a lot of really, really nasty stuff going on across the subgenre. The vampire is pretty much the go-to horror other. So you can use the vampire to talk about gender, to talk about sexuality, to talk about class, and unfortunately also it can get very anti-Semitic. It's the main focus of my research at the minute into vampires. And rather than dwell on all of the sort of anti-Semitism, there's so much brilliant writing out there. People like Chloe Hyman are doing some brilliant research into that. I would love to talk about two less negative ones. The first would be the television show Judah, which is sort of, it creates its own entirely new Jewish lore for the vampire, which I find really interesting. It turns the vampire on its head. It goes more in the direction of a superhero story, almost like Blade, and playing with the anti-hero, which I think is something that's a really interesting way to take on something that had been so anti-Semitic and so harmful. The other is to go back to Roman Polanski with his film Phyllis Vampire Killers from, I believe, 1968. he does some really interesting things. He sets his entire film within a shtetl, and it's in a world pre-Holocaust, before any of that has happened. And he speaks a lot when he's talking about that film about what he was intending there. He was setting up an entire world that was just for the Jews. It was before any cruelty had really touched that setting uh, in the way that we would sort of acknowledge it now. And his antagonist is not Jewish, but all of his heroes are, which I find something that's really, really touching to watch, especially knowing what perspective that comes from. Um, and he has a very subversive ending, which I'm about to spoil for you all now, unfortunately, where his Jewish heroes are transformed into vampires at the end, and they spread vampirism throughout the whole world. And it's this very optimistic, very funny note to end on, that the Jews survive in Fearless Vampire Killers, and they are the beginning of something new. Vampirism for Polanski isn't an ending, and it's not. It is a villainous force, but it's not a darkness that ever actually takes over. And the Jews, even if they become vampires, get to survive in his film, which I think that's a really interesting way to do vampires, to still have that darkness and yet subvert both the anti-Semitism and the tragedy that he could have gone with. It's a very funny movie. I would recommend it.
It's been years since I've seen it. I have to rewatch with this new insight. It's very interesting. Um, let's move on to Golem stories and talk about that and a bit more, and how if there are modern interpretations of the Golem story that take
So,
a different path than the old German films.
so Golem stories have started on screen sort of around 1920, and we do tend to keep coming back to that story. Maybe not as often as things like vampires, but golems are probably the most explored part of Jewish horror other than Dybbuk's. Um, One of the easiest ways to actually see it is in Frankenstein stories. Um, the entire idea of creating life really came from the golem before it came from Mary Shelley, which I find really interesting. Um, my personal favorite example of a golem story isn't actually in film, it's in a novel from the 1980s called The Tribe by Barry Wood. It is an absolutely incredible book that the author, I think, now disowns, but it's able to incorporate a golem into a modern setting and into modern anti-Semitism. It takes away the setting, but it keeps the actual subject itself. And in that way, the theme is able to evolve. With the golem, you sort of get this story that initially starts off as it's a figure of protection in the original folklore. And then as we have moved over centuries, it has become this figure almost of revenge. And there are some really interesting films out there, like The Golem by the Paz brothers, which I think was 2018, where having this power becomes a real issue of morality, and it becomes an issue of the morality of revenge when your community has been so persecuted. It's able to tell both an individual story and a collective, more thematic story,
Mm-hmm.
which I think has been explored so wonderfully, and yet there's still so much more to do there.
I've a long thought that there's a very interesting and potentially deep golem story, modern golem story that could be told in film right now, especially given everything that that the Jewish community has been going through with rising anti-Semitism.
Absolutely, and it sort of gives it's an age-old story, really, of what happens when somebody who has no power or perhaps has very limited power is suddenly granted it by whatever means. There's so much room in there for complexity. I think that there is a modern Golem film just waiting to be written that
yes.
I'm very excited someday.
Hopefully someone here will write it. I've been trying to think of the right way to do it for quite a while. you mentioned Dybbuk and possession stories, which is another general area of Jewish horror that has been explored, especially in some recent films, but is also a very deep well. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I think ghosts and ghost stories are my personal favorite. I think there are so many different ways to tell the story of a haunting. The Dybbuk specifically almost blends haunting and possession, which I think is a really interesting and unique cultural and theological angle to have on the concept. Again, I'm going to give an example of an absolutely wonderful Dybbuk film, Demon, from 2015 by Marcin Rona, who is unfortunately no longer with us. The story is used to explore specific sects of Polish complicity within the Holocaust and to explore what happens almost to the land and to the memory of a place when such awful things occur on that soil. It's a very thoughtful movie. It's probably what we would call elevated horror, even though I know some people really don't like that phrase. It is thematically rich, it is very historically conscious. And I think that is really the place that the Dybbuk holds in Jewish horror. What the pattern that so far has really been coming out is that the Dybbuk has largely been treated like it is just a ghost without that cultural specificity, and the Jewish element of it almost gets treated as novelty in some films. I came across a film quite recently called Killer Sofa, which was a sofa that was haunted by a Dybbuk and killed anyone in it. So, you know, we can do elevated horror and we can do schlock within Jewish horror. But yeah, with the Dybbuk, there's a really interesting theme going through there, that the person who is possessed, haunted by the Dybbuk, whichever word you'd like to use, is both a prisoner to that entity and also strangely empowered by it. They, with Dybbuk stories, they're almost told differently narratively from Christian possession stories. In a lot of Christian possession stories, the focus is on the relatives of the victim and of their experience of seeing their loved one go through something they can't control, like within things like The Exorcist and stuff like that. Whereas in Dybbuk stories, there is a lot more focus on the individual and what it means to be going through that within yourself. I find it a very interesting narrative difference between the two specific cultural variations on the ghost.
That's very interesting. Where do you see Jewish horror today? What recent projects have caught your interest, whether they're film or television or novels? And what do you think the future looks like for Jewish horror?
Within the last sort of 5 to 10 years, we have seen an explosion in Jewish horror that I find really exciting. With things like the Jewish Book of Horror, which is a short story anthology I'd recommend, with films like Demon being so critically acclaimed, it feels like we're on the edge of something. It feels like we're on the cusp of just this absolute explosion. In terms of projects that I've really liked over the past few years, the short story collection, The Sweet Fragrance of Life by Elizabeth Schwartz was absolutely wonderful. She explores Jewish horror from a sort of Angela Carter-esque voice. That I know for fellow goth girls like myself, that is just
me too.
word is Angela Carter.
Yeah.
And yeah, her stories are absolutely wonderful. I won't spoil any of them here, but they have this this very dark comedy running through them that I think is just absolutely fantastic reading. In terms of other projects, one of the things that I've recently discovered is an artist in the UK called Hugo Max, who takes Jewish horror films on tour. He has recently taken De Golem, but he also takes German expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu. He completely removes their soundtrack. Music is one of the most empathetic parts of film. Music tells us how to feel a lot of the time. And he improvises a live score every single night that he takes these films on tour. I was lucky enough to interview him recently, and I asked him about the anti-Semitism of some of these films. And he was saying that every night it is something that he reckons with. watching these films that are so beautiful and so heartbreaking, these things that can be so poetic but also sort of hateful. And every night he brings this plasticity to those films. He brings such a flexible sense of meaning through his music. And yeah, it's something that I think is bringing Jewish horror film to a new audience. When I went to one of his screenings last year, most of the crowd had no idea what De Golem was. And yet to have them brought back to life in that way was really exciting. And anything that gets German Expressionist films to the general public is brilliant in my eyes.
That sounds fantastic. I want to see that immediately. So I think we've gotten to the end of our defined questions. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Honestly, just that I'm excited to see every single voice on this panel and hopefully where Jewish horror goes after a big discussion like this. And if anybody ever wants feedback on their ideas, please let me know, because I am pretty much the encyclopedia of Jewish horror at this point.
That's fantastic. Well, your work is so interesting and timely as we look to tell more and different Jewish stories. Thank you so much. I encourage everyone to check out Molly's website and her writing. We'll drop a link in the chat, and I think we'll also be sending out information on everything we mentioned in this event to participants after the fact as well. So you'll get an email if you miss that. And thank you, Molly. Thank you so much. That was great. What a great way to start things off. All right, next up we have some fun Jewish monsters with Jack Zients, who is the Jewish Monster Hunter. Jack has a website called Jewish Monster Hunting, and we were thrilled to find him in our research, and turns out that Molly and Jack know each other, so she made an introduction for us. And Jack studies Torah, Talmud, and other Jewish writings to learn about demons, angels, Dybbuk, ghosts, giants, and Jewish magic. His website is a delightful well of deep inspiration for writers. There's so much there to mine. He pieces together this legacy from original sources and contemporary scholars, and the study helps him learn more deeply what it means to be Jewish, to love Torah, and to understand God. He does a lot of teaching through this work that is really wonderful. And also, hopefully, to have a lot of fun fighting Jewish monsters, something we all aspire to. So, Jack, you're an expert in human-computer interaction by day and a Jewish monster hunter by night. Why Jewish monsters? How did you become a Jewish monster hunter?
So I was the kind of kid who grew up with a pile of folklore collections on my bookshelf. I probably at one point could have told you the entire Arabian Nights by memory. But the only collection of kind of folklore I did not have on my shelf was Jewish folklore. Except I think I had one collection of Helm stories. And it didn't occur to me at the time that that was a gap, right? It's just what it was. If you walk into the library, if you walk into a bookstore, you just grab what you got, and that's what I had. And it was like that through childhood, through education, occasionally picking up that there was a gap. I ran into the Golem. I ran into Dybbuk, but only through that kaleidoscopic blender that we call pop culture, which amazingly enough gets all of it wrong and backwards. Fun and sometimes endearing, but usually with very little connection to any of its sources. And for me, it kind of remained that way until about 10 years ago when two things happened at the same time. One, two friends of mine were producing a wonderful podcast called Throwing Shade, Better Living Through Jewish Demonology. And they were going hardcore shadim being Jewish demons, and 50 episodes, an hour long each. Like they were going as deep as you can go. Wonderful podcast. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was an assistant rabbi at my synagogue who wanted to get some high school classes going so the kids could like have interesting choices to pick. And I'm like, here's the topic. you need to get someone to teach a class on Jewish monsters and magic. And for those folks in the audience who don't know what a terrible mistake that was, let me assure you, going to a rabbi and saying, here's an idea, somebody should do this, immediately gets turned around and said, congratulations, you'll start in 6 months, right? You got plenty of time. I had no idea what I was doing. I had 6 months to put six classes together. And one of the things that I about me is I'm a very hands-on, very tactile person. Props are a big deal, right? If you want to get people's attention, you need to put something in front of them that they can pick up and hold and help them understand. And so when I went to start teaching these series of classes, I invented this whole persona of the Jewish monster hunter. I'm a big fan of the TV shows and the tropes like Supernatural, where you're going around, you're protecting people from monsters that may stop by. And so I kind of invented this persona and I showed up and taught this series of classes with a footlocker that I built and filled with all of the paraphernalia that a Jewish monster hunter, according to tradition, would have. And I've been building these kits for ages. And there's something about handing a teenager a box of hardwood ash and saying, okay, let's talk about how there are, according to the Jewish tradition, there are shadim. They're all around you. And if you want to find out if they're around you, you sprinkle hardwood ash around their beds. And by the way, they all have feet that look like birds' feet. And in the morning, you'll see the tracks of the birds around your bed. That's really different than trying to say, and by the way, according to this section of talk, no, like this is a lived experience of the Jewish people going back millennia. The writings are the capturing of the lived experience. And that's where the whole idea being the Jewish monster hunter came from was what was the experience of that people are going through? How does that actually translate into material objects and practices? And we could talk for hours and hours and hours about everything that the modern world has lost along the way, but it's still there to go back to. It's still part of the culture. It's still part of the record.
That's fantastic. I love the tactile nature of that. It brings people into the experience, especially for younger people whose world is so absorbed in screens, who didn't
Right.
live before, who weren't alive before we were so involved, so
Right.
absorbed in our screens. To have that kind of, it's like role play, right? In a lot of ways.
It's like role play, and it's a way to kind of channel, in a practical sense, a historical memory. There's a podcast that I do with a friend of mine named John Baltusberger, who's a Jewish, very good Jewish horror novelist. And there's a comment that I make in the first episode, and I've had more feedback about this one throwaway line than I probably have anything else that I've ever done, where I make the comment in the first episode that for all the Jewish women who are young and old who are listening to the podcast, they've all been cheated. That the daily life rituals that were part of their great grandmother's world, whether that world was Ashkenazi Europe, Mizrahi North Africa, Sephardic Spain, Turkey, Greece, their great grandmothers were power centers in their communities. They knew how to make charms. They knew how to make cordials. There were all sorts of home rituals that they would be part of. Remember, these are an era where nobody called a doctor. There was no doctor in the area. If there was, they were expensive and probably terrible anyway. And they were always guys who didn't listen to anything that was going on anyway. They thought they knew. So home medicine, which by the way, the line that we make today about medicine being like this chemistry and broken bones and things, and it was understood, but there was a much richer conception of medicine that included both the spiritual world, the mental world, the physical world. These things were not divided. And so this was a key part of how people experienced the world. And just to give a very quick example of this, about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to be in Israel, my only time I've been. My older daughter was doing an exchange program, and I ended up in the Jewish Museum in Jerusalem with parents of other students who were in this program. And at that point, they had this exhibit called Jewish Life Cycles. So birth, death, bar mitzvah, wedding, like all of these things and material artifacts. And I was standing next to a woman who's American of Persian Jewish descent, and she started jumping up and down. And I just happened to be standing with her, a lovely woman named Farah. She's like, my family has one of these. And she's pointing at a silver anti-Lilith amulet that is hanging on the wall that is part of their birth life cycle thing. And she's like, I have no idea what that is. So I explained who Lilith the demon is and how Lilith has terrified Jews for thousands of years. And she broke down crying. When her daughters were born, she had two daughters, including one in the program. Her mother had given her this amulet to hold on her chest during labor and delivery. And when labor and delivery was over and the baby and mom were safe, the mom swiped it back to hand off to the next member of the family, right? I have no idea if she had no idea, if her mother had any idea what that amulet actually was, other than being a tradition within the family. But Farah understood immediately and intuitively that this was her family and her tradition protecting her.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not she immediately decided that she believed that there really was a demon called Lilith or not was completely immaterial.
Mm-hmm.
She felt protected in a way that she hadn't because she didn't understand what that amulet signified. And it was, it was 15 years later that she felt that. And that's that material gap that we lack because of the Haskalah, Jewish Enlightenment, because of migration, because of all of the things that make up the modern world, because of the blender of pop culture, we lose that connection to all of that experience, which has a lot to share and teach us, right? There's a lot there that is really meaningful, even if you decide that you still don't believe that Lilith's real, she's still terrifying, even if she's not real. And that's the thing that I think in the modern world people have a hard time understanding is something can be terrifying even if it's not real. Labor and delivery is absolutely can be terrifying. People die, women die all the time, even in the modern world, through that process. There's a connection, a very, very deep connection there that we lose when we start to buy into this idea of disenchantment, which never actually happened, but we in the modern world like to pretend that it happened. So anyway, I could rant about this for an hour, but
I could as well. I've actually done public speaking on disenchantment and reenchantment in the modern world.
right.
One of the ideas that the story you just told brought up is how much depth of storytelling, bringing it back to
Yep.
the group of writers we are, how much depth of storytelling can be gleaned from these ideas. In this case, the conflict between modernity and the roles of women, and the idea that science supersedes intuition, which is and on a certain level, spiritual belief for a lot within the culture, and how that has actually feeds into ideas about the roles of women in society and the culture and their role, our role in the culture, and what's been lost, and what could be regained by folding those things back in. And
Absolutely.
and the application of that to storytelling and to horror storytelling is very interesting. You don't know why you're frightened. You don't know why you're in danger. You don't know how to combat it without bringing in these older ideas that have been rejected.
Absolutely. And just to share like one other anecdote, I'm very active in social media, and I have fascinating, wonderful conversations with people of all type. And there's a question that I've been asked multiple times recently, including by a friend about a month ago, which is I am about to physically move into a new space. In one case, it was a house. In another case, it was an office. I'm very uncomfortable with that. In one case, the office had previously the occupant had been somebody had been very hostile and anti-Semitic. In the other case, the house just felt weird. It was beautiful, but it felt weird when they moved in. And their question was really, really simple and deep, which is what does the Jewish experience, what does Jewish lore tell us to do about this? Right? Is there a set of practice? What can I do to feel better in this place? Can you do an exorcism of a room? Right? What can you, and so I put together this whole cheat sheet, right? Like here's the steps, right? And they've done them and they've helped,
Mhm.
right? And again, like I am not in a position to say did they help because of they made the experience psychologically valid to them and it helped them navigate through that. That's a very real thing. Did it help because there actually were Dibbakim or Shadim and it helped, remove them from the place? I'm not smart enough to know the answer to that, but I know that the Jewish experience and Jewish lore tells us exactly what to do. There's all sorts of things you can do, and that's a very practical experience that people have. And if you were to go to a Jewish rabbi, for example, they would have no idea what to do. Let me assure you that that's the case. Unless you're hanging out with a Hasidic Rebbe, in which case they would have a very good idea. But in most cases, most Jewish rabbis will be like, I can come over, I guess, but like that's the best you're going to get. So
Yeah.
there's again, there's a practical lived experience that is still there to be found and built on in this older lore that I think is very meaningful.
Yes. Yeah. And the spiritual idea of cleansing a space is something that runs across all cultures.
Yep,
Native American saging
yep, yep,
rituals, for instance. So, of course, we have our own. We just have
yep,
to retrieve it. And
exactly.
and moving to retrieving of ideas. You have a treasure trove of inspiration for Jewish horror writers on your website and in your work. Can you tell us a little bit about the resources that you offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been my website's a little getting a little needs a little bit of a refresh right now. But what I've been doing with the website is picking topics like this, like Shadim or the Evil Eye, trying to piece together a short statement about, very readable, fun statement about what is really going on in the lore, along with kind of tongue-in-cheek tips for a prospective apprentice monster hunter. Like, what are the things that you should draw out of this? Because again, that tactile nature, this is not theoretic knowledge that I'm looking for. It's how does this actually play out in the real world? All sourced. By the way, immediate thing I want to tell everybody, there is so much bad information about Jewish lore out there. If you're looking at a book and it doesn't cite its sources directly to first original sources, throw it away. I'm just going to tell you right now, throw it away. There's so much bad information. So I'm trying to be very, very clear about where all my stuff is coming from. The reason why my website got a little bit is a little bit old and I need to kind of get it going again was about 3 years ago. I started a related project, which I'll show an example of a minute, where I've developed and published Jewish monsters and magic trading cards. So all of the effort that was going into the website turned into the trading cards, and I'll show some examples in a minute. And I do want to underscore the magic part of it. I've given some examples, but the rabbit hole goes really, really deep on Jewish magic as well as monsters. So I'll show some examples in a second.
Well, let's move on to that. Jack has prepared a slideshow for us with some new and different inspirations, and he's going to tell us some scary stories about Jewish monsters.
Absolutely. So let me just find the share button and make sure I do this right.
There
Okay.
you go.
Laura, can you see the
Yes,
screen?
yeah,
Okay.
we're good to
Okay.
go.
Excellent. So I want to emphasize that like Molly has already done a wonderful job talking about golems and Dybbuk's, and I didn't want to like showcase the monsters that I knew that people would kind of know about, and I had a feeling that other panelists would want to talk to. I wanted to get weird fast because if there's one thing about Jewish lore, if it's not really weird, you probably aren't reading it carefully enough. So let me start with one of my all-time favorite. Note that it's card number one, and it's actually my handle on Twitter or X now, which is the Adne Hasada, Jewish vegetable people. Not so you all might know the story about how It's unclear in the Torah who Cain and Abel might have married, right? Because wait, where, are they marrying their sisters? What? No, according to Jewish lore, there were 1,000 generations before before Adam and Eve. They were mostly all destroyed by God because they were found wanting. One of those are the Adne Hasada, the vegetable people. They were proto-humans. They are omnivorous plants. They look like people or like apes, except they're connected to the ground by a vine in their stomach, and they grow from seeds. You can only kill them by killing their vine, and good luck because they're kind of hostile, and getting close is a challenge. But the thing is, they grow from seeds, and while they are mostly all wiped out during the flood, according to the Jewish lore, not all of them. There's still pockets of seeds. And in the story of Exodus, if you read the rabbinic commentary, Moses actually threatens Pharaoh with bringing adversaries from the ground to harass him and the Egyptians. It was the Adne Hasada that he was talking about, implying that Moses had access to those seeds. So if you can imagine as a storyteller, your human, presumably we're starting with human characters, have found themselves in a location where either they have access to the seeds or probably more unfortunately, the Adne Asada have already been planted and grown. You find yourself in a very, very strange world. Are they good? Are they bad? They're just there. And are they friendly? Are they hostile? Both. And by the way, they're delicious. According to the lore, they are quite edible. And that actually plays a role in Jewish lore where an anesad is served up to a rabbi and it looks like a creepy human hand. But, you know, it was served for dinner. I personally think they taste like broccoli, but, you can use your imagination as to what they might taste like. So, just as an example, right? The lore gets way, way weirder and more fun than just golems and Dybbuk, as wonderful characters as those might be. So to keep this moving, Shadim, Jewish demons, they're described in great detail in the Talmud, not like the Catholic drag that Molly Adams so wonderfully explained, right? They're not evil any more than a shark or a wolf is evil. They might be homicidal assholes. In fact, they often are, but many of them are better Jews than the Jews are in the stories. And there are actually Shadim who are friends of the rabbis of the Talmud, and one named Yosef Hasheda who is called upon to help answer key questions about Jewish lore because he has studied at a level that the rabbis were aspiring to. So very, very different than a conception. They are at times tricksters, at times hostile, at times friendly. They have their own rules and their own halakha, but they are also under God. They are not an opposition to God. They are part of God's world. They're just a weird, dangerous part. There's parts of Jewish magic that involve using mirrors or cups or other reflective surfaces to call them, to ask them questions, and it was allowed, except you were cautioned to never trust them because they lied, but it was done, right? So it's a much, much richer, deeper world than, ugh, I'm going to get you, kill you, and drag you to hell and stop, right? It's a much more different world. And by the way, so much of Jewish magical lore is tied into defending yourselves from Shadim. Again, we could talk for hours about all the techniques. Estries, Jewish vampires. People always want to say, hey, like, is there a Jewish vampire? Well, there is not the Bela Lugosi, Black Cape, all of like the lore that has evolved as pop culture rules about vampires. However, there are things that kind of sort of scratch that itch if you're looking for that kind of a framing. So estries are women, and stop by definition. They are the equivalent of werewolves who are men. They are shape changers. They can fly. They drink blood. That's the vampiric aspect of it. In some cases, they are described as shadim. One first rule about Jewish lore is Jews are amazing at commentary and we're terrible at taxonomy, right? There is not one specific way to understand everything. It's all of the stories argue with each other. So estries are both shadim or they are cursed women, and that distinction is really important. And I'll get to that in a second. So to fly, to use their powers, they have to be able to let their hair down. Binding it up robs them of their powers. There's a very clear off switch that they can use themselves or that can be hostilely done toward them. Killing, this is not an overpowered Marvel Universe kind of an estuary. Estuaries are very easy to kill. They're no more deadly than a human, maybe a little bit. It's getting them to stay dead that's the problem. An estuary has drunk blood and you have to bury her with rocks in her mouth, otherwise she will come back. Again, there's that challenging off switch that's built in. You also can give them bread and salt to heal them if you have hurt them. Okay, well, why would the lore talk about helping someone you just hurt? It's because you don't actually know if they're Shadim, if they're cursed. Knowing what's going on is a real challenge, except that you know that they're dangerous, which leaves you with this set of practical and moral choices. Have you hurt one? Could you hurt one? What do you do if you help one, you are now taking moral responsibility. What if you guessed wrong? Right? So it's a very complex relationship that is built up around what you do about estuaries. Demonic doubles, soulmates from hell. One of my favorite things about Jewish lore is there's an idea that's called the Beshert, which is your soulmate. Talked about a lot in Talmud and later lore, but the idea of a Beshert can get twisted on its head. Why? Because the Shadim, who I said can be jerks, right? They hang out, they have access to information from God via the angels in heaven. They know things they're not really supposed to know, including they know who your Beshert is, and they're shape changers. And since they know who your Beshert is and they can change shape, it might just be that that person that you're so enamored with may be just a wonderful person. It also could be that they've gone and taken out that wonderful person and have replaced that wonderful person, and you are in for a world of trouble. And again, understanding how to deal with that and figure that out is part of the joy of this kind of a problem, right? There's this great set of uncertainty baked around. Like, we all have those moments, right? Where our spouse or partner may be making us a little crazy. Are they a Shadim? Did something happen? Have they been replaced? Like, what's going on here? Ibarim, Ibers. So Molly talked about Dybbuk's, and Molly and Laura were talking about the joys of possession stories. There's an implication in most cultural possession stories that it's a bad thing. Jews aren't so clear on that point. There are bad possessions. The idea of a Dybbuk, a Dybbuk is someone who has sinned in some significant way. There's a whole metaphysics around that. They're off the wheel. They're taken possession. That's a bad thing. But what if the person who is possessing you is holy and powerful and strong? That's a thing. And the Kabbalists, particularly the Spanish Kabbalists, were really into the idea that you could go out with a shovel, dig a trench over a rabbi's grave, go lie in that grave, sing psalms all night, and hopefully you'll be impregnated in a spiritual sense by the rabbi, and their power and their wisdom will leave with you. That is the exact flip of the classic idea of possession being a negative thing, which is there is power, there is wisdom, there is strength in the people who have passed in front of us. How do we access that? And what lengths will we go to access that? Feldmestrin. I mentioned already, I already kind of gave the spiel of how much of the old world we have lost. And again, whether this is an Ashkenazi Yiddish term, but like there are equivalents in all parts of the Jewish world. The idea of segulot, of charms, is often referred to as kitchen table magic, right? Well, there's also kitchen table necromancy, right? In the Jewish community, the idea of necromancy is very much tied up in the idea that the people who have come before us, who have passed, are somehow closer and have more access to the angels and God than we do. And so when we are desperate, and when the rabbis aren't doing it and the doctors aren't doing it, who are we going to turn to? We're going to turn to those people who love us, who are closer to God, who can potentially put in a good word for us. And Feldmestrins were Jewish women. They were specialists in this kind of kitchen table necromancy. And one of the things that they did, which is very well documented, is they would do what's called grave measuring or cemetery measuring. Remember, cemeteries were typically very small and local things. You would take string the kind of string that you would use to make a candle wick. You'd go out and measure around the grave while reciting prayers, and then you would go and make a candle wick out of it, which you then use to make soul candles. The soul candles would then, some of them would be saved for this purpose, some of them would be given to the yeshiva, to the rabbis, to the poor for candles. And on Yom Kippur or Hoshana Rabbah, on one of these special days, you would light and burn that candle and use that as a way to get a message across the veil to your relatives who might be able to put in a good word. And remember, these are communities where bad stuff was happening all the time, right? Whether it's somebody who just had an accident, whether it was a pogrom, whether it was a plague. I mean, these were communities that were in jeopardy a lot and needed these additional approaches. And then the last one that I wanted to bring up is the Baal Shem or the Balai Shem, which is the plural. So rabbis typically are kind of straight-laced. They're, they're kind of like, hey, here's how we pray, here's how we do marriage, here's how we bury people. Like there's a kind of a structure around that. And then we get to the weird ones, the wonder rabbis. Baal Shem again is a Ashkenazi term, but there are Mizrahi and Sephardic equivalents of the wonder rabbi or the wizard rabbi, often traveling, sometimes with their own pulpits, but they are exorcists. They are psychopomps. They have a connection to the spiritual world, and they have a connection to the mechanics of Jewish magic. And I don't have time to give you the whole spiel about Jewish magic, but one great example of it, which is very much tied into how golems are created, is the use of holy names. That's where the term Baal Shem comes from, master of the name. God has a wide variety of names. There are names of angels, even names of demons that can potentially be channeled as part of these rituals. And the understanding of which name to use and how is a key element of Jewish magic. And by the way, that kind of name magic is not something that's typically explored in modern storytelling. And there's a whole range of opportunities to go channel that other approach, which is very well grounded in Jewish lore, but also in other lores as well. Okay, that was a fast roll through a couple of different monster types and a couple of different character types that all could be brought back and leveraged in modern stories. I am not a professional writer. This room is we are filled with professional writers who are way more creative than me about how to go do that. But it sets an opportunity for how to do that. The last thing I wanted to note is there are lots of places to go next if you're interested. There are not nearly as many books as you might think, but given how much Jews like to write books, but there are some very good ones. Here's some examples. On my website, there is a post from a couple years ago that I update occasionally called A Jewish Monsters and Magic Reading List in English. That if you are interested in these topics and you want to dive in, these are all in English, really good source points to start with. And then, of course, I have to add a plug for my Monster Magic trading cards because I've got 108 cards. Each one picks up a monster or magic point and gives you kind of an anchor point. And I am more than happy to provide the bibliography that goes with that if somebody wants to see that and wants to reach out and ask for it. So, Laura, back to you. I just wanted that was the fast run that you and I had talked about.
That was amazing. So much inspiration just in that, and to think there are 108 more cards for people to go through. It's just a gold mine for writers and horror writers in general, not just Jewish writers. There's just so much there. And you've been so generous sharing all of that with us. The Jack has given us permission to make that PDF that he used available to all of you guys. So we'll be sharing it, and we'll also be sending it in the email, the follow-up email as well. Thank you so much. It's been such a thrill getting to know you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I just want to tell everyone here, I admire all of your work. I'm not a writer, you all. I can't wait to see what you all do. And if anybody needs or has any questions or wants to hit me up offline for sources, I love nothing better than getting weird questions at 1 o'clock in the morning of somebody who absolutely needs like like point me at the thing, and like I've got this huge stash of literature I can go dig through. So absolutely, people should feel free to reach out. Thanks so much, Laura.
Thank you, and you'll be hearing from me for sure. I'll talk to you later. Thank you. All right. That was exhilarating. So great. Now, next, for our next segment, we wanted to delve into the actual practice of writing Jewish horror stories and talk about the experience of Jewish writers in the room developing this kind of storytelling. And we all were thrilled by the show Agatha All Along last year, and we really wanted to do something about that. We thought it would be interesting and instructive to do a case study of bringing Jewish stories to the screen, and we also wanted to talk about Agatha All Along, which was one of the most successful horror episodics in recent years, particularly the sixth episode, which was called Familiar by Thy Side, and explored the backstory of, spoiler alert, Joe Locke's character, Billy Maximoff, first called Teen before we knew his name in the show, who was revealed as Billy Maximoff, aka Wiccan, aka, and most germane to this discussion, William Kaplan. That episode opened with a beautiful sequence of William's bar mitzvah, which moved a lot of us very much. Here to discuss the creative process in the room on this episode are the writer of Familiar by Thy Side, Jason Rostovsky, and the writer of episodes 2, Circle Sewn with Fate, Unlock Thy Hidden Gate, and episode 9, Maiden Mother Crone, Laura Donnie, who was one of the other Jewish writers in the room and who first pitched the bar mitzvah idea. Welcome. Thank you for being with us, you guys.
Hello.
For those of us, hi. So first off, I want to ask Jason, for those of us who haven't watched Agatha, can you describe who William Kaplan and Billy Maximoff are and how they're connected? And also just discuss the character's Jewishness and the connection to the underlying Marvel IP, if you will.
Yeah, totally. So Billy Maximoff, aka Teen, is one of the twin superpowered sons of Wanda Maximoff and Vision. We're introduced to them in WandaVision in the MCU in episode 3, where Wanda sort of magically gives birth to these twins while living in this hex that she's put over a small town called Westview. And so at first, Billy and Tommy are sort of these magical constructs of this world that she's built. And then even more spoilers at the end of WandaVision, which everyone should watch because it's incredible if you haven't already. But she collapses this hex, which is this sort of world she's built in response to this grief that she's processing. And when she collapses that, Billy and Tommy, being constructs of that, are sort of absorbed into it. And then, unbeknownst to everybody, released kind of out into the world as like disembodied spirits or souls or whatever they really are. And then, as for William Kaplan, he's just like a young teenager who also lives in Eastview, outside of Westview, and he ends up dying very tragically in a car accident, sort of at the moment this hex is collapsing. And then Billy, um, magically moves into his body. So he inhabits William Kaplan's sort of empty shell, his vessel, if you will, and then, ultimately his life. And so they're connected because Billy becomes William Kaplan. And in the comics, canonically, William Kaplan is Jewish. I know there's a lot of deeper lore, but technically Billy Maximoff, I guess, through the whole line of all that, is maybe also Jewish. But definitely William Kaplan and sort of the person that Billy becomes is Jewish in the comics. And then, that was really important for all of us in the room to carry through into the show.
I know that you worked with a rabbi consulting on that episode. There have been some discussion in the press of how much Joe Locke studied with the rabbi. It was important to get that representation of Jewish life right on the screen.
Yeah.
I would love for both of you to discuss how that manifested in the room. What was within the context of the work experience? How was it discussed? How did it develop? What can we as writers learn from the way that was brought into the process?
Yeah, the in the room we didn't work really with the rabbi. That was sort of more like when they entered pre-production, and then on set there was a rabbi who was wonderful, and she was really informative and kind of helped bring a lot of the authenticity to life with everyone on set. But for us, like it was kind of Donnie and I being sort of the touchstone for a
I know,
lot of
I
the
was like,
Donnie
we
film.
were the rabbis of
Yeah,
the
we were
room.
the honorary rabbis. And yeah, like yeah, it was important for everyone, not just us, which was really, I think, part of why so much of it shows up on screen is that there was like a lot of care and love and attention put into it. And I think, at least in terms of episode 6, like both from me and Donnie, if I could say, we pulled, I think, just a lot from our own experiences, and kind of relied on that, like, what all of it means to us and what that experience, that lived in experience is like.
Yeah, and I think what's important to add on that too is like obviously as every the panel like Jack even referring to Mizrahi and Sephardic and Ashkenazi, like there's so many types of Jews and the diaspora of Jews and denominations of Jewishness. And I will speak for Jason and I when we say we come from a very like Ashkenazi, like reform Jewish upbringing. So like I do think that bar mitzvah in the show is a very specific kind. So it's important to note that that's not like what all bar mitzvahs look like, but also just anecdotally to share like there was this, William Joe performs a prayer and there was this big discussion of like should he say Adonai or Hashem, and like we were, I think there was a conversation. I think the rabbi was like, well, it's Hashem. And like Jason and I were like, it's Adonai. Like, it's Adonai. Like, no, Hashem would sound insane. And like, we were just literally thinking of our own respective bar and bat mitzvahs. And we're like, is it an
Um,
East Coast thing? Because Jason and I also both grew up on the West Coast and we're like, we're no, there's a difference between East Coast and West Coast. Like, and so that is just like a fun little example of like, we were like, what hills do we want to die on? And I think strictly because like of our sense of Jewishness, we were like, it's Adonai.
yeah.
And what was really lovely about working with our showrunner Jack Schaefer and our producer Mary Lavanos and the director and everybody is like everyone was pretty deferential to me and Jason as like the Jewish thermometer sticks. And so again, I want to point out that like that's our experience, but I think rightly if a room is trying to explore like uh, a marginalized community, you listen to the voices that belong to that community. And so we were really afforded that.
Yeah.
And that's why he says Adonai.
Well, and that's something that's very important to us as a committee. We've discussed, we've had a lot of discussion about how to have that cultural background of Jewishness represented in rooms where where it comes into storytelling in the same way that other cultural backgrounds are represented. And that's something that didn't feel necessary, until recently. And so it's really great to hear that was important in the room with you guys. I know that in talking about the bar mitzvah scene, I know that I've heard that you, Laura, were the person who first pitched that idea. How can you give us a sense of how the structural and storytelling development of that episode unfolded in the room from the beginning of that pitch and the idea of focusing on that as a way of introducing the character of William Kaplan and telling the backstory,
Yeah.
Gene's
First,
backstory.
I do want to thank you for really internalizing that I told you I pitched the bar mitzvah episode, and it's only important to me because I'm so jealous of the episode Jason wrote. Like he executed it so beautifully and perfectly and in a way I could only dream of, that I am like, I do want the little bit of credit, that because like that's all I did. Because like in Jason's hands, it's my favorite episode. When I read his first draft, I cried. When I watched it, I cried. Like and that's why I do want everyone to know that I did send an email saying we should have a bar mitzvah episode, which is literally all I did. Um,
Pitch it in the
but
room. You were a champion of it. I
I
turned to you a
I
lot for
thank you,
guidance in
but
that.
I appreciate that. But I mean, it really came from, at some point early on in the room, we realized that like, okay, we're telling the story of Billy Maximoff and William Kaplan becoming Wiccan, or on the road teen, or like it's sort of combining these two people to become this super person. And I think I'm pretty ignorant Marvel wise, despite having worked for them. And I had a vague sense of like, Magneto from the X-Men, I think, was a Holocaust survivor, and like there's a world. I think I understand that he's maybe Wanda Maximoff's dad, and so that's Jew. Like I think I understood like vaguely, like, this character has Judaism in them. And so when we decided to lean when we decided we were being we got the green light from our showrunner Jack and our producer Mary to do that. I remember feeling so giddy and like so exciting, and that so excited, and like I know enough about Marvel to know it's not like here's a Jewish superhero, here's a Jewish superhero. Like I knew, like, and we wrote this in 2022, it aired in 2024, and still that recently it felt so huge to be like explicitly saying we're going to have a Jewish superhero, because that immediately makes a Jewish person, it immediately makes that Jewish character strong, cool, sexy, in the like, in the sort of analytical way of using that word, like worth something, right? And so it was really exciting to that we were given this opportunity, and like everyone behind, in charge was like, yeah, go for it. And so I think we did the math, and we realized, we wanted Agatha All Along to take place 3 years after WandaVision, which, the twins were disappeared in WandaVision when they were 10 years old, which would make them 13 years old. And it really was that sort of simple, where I was like, well, if they're 13, you should have a bar mitzvah. Like I'm always, in anything I do, I'm like, there should be a bar mitzvah episode. And I think it's half a joke. It's like pretty true though. Because I do think a bar mitzvah offers like a very organic structure when we're talking about growing and changing and using ritual to do that. Um, and so I think when we knew we needed to merge Billy with William to have a ritual that was quite literally about evolving and becoming a different version of yourself was a no-brainer. Um, and so I think that all felt really organically like a Jewishness to pick from. And then like fun little things too of, my awareness that the actual thing that changes when you become a bar mitzvah is like you're allowed to read from the Torah, right? That's sort of like the Jewish definition of adulthood, is like you can read from the scroll. And I also think that means you can be a part of a minyan. And a minyan is a group of 10 people, and in certain sects of Judaism, nothing's legal unless you have a minyan. You can't do anything cool or important unless there's 10 of you. And that's an awful lot like a coven. And the idea that there were some very intuitive parallels between that, like, oh, we have William becoming a bar mitzvah, which means he can be a part of a minyan, which means he can be a part of a community that makes Jewish ritual happen. And then we have Teen go on a sort of road bar mitzvah where he's doing this ritual with these witches to become a part of their coven, was just like all there. So we couldn't not, you know?
Yes, yes. And there are also connections between the mythology around witches and Jewish culture that go back thousands of years. And so the connection between Minyan and Coven, which I had not thought of before you just mentioned it, seems like there may be actual connection between that historically, and might be something to ask one of our experts about at some point. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A, because the other thing that I thought was very interesting about Agatha is the use of occultist material and tropes, which felt very well researched to me as someone who's been a professional researcher in that area. I often am disappointed because there's such a deep well to mine for that kind of thing, and people have a tendency to either use the same old things that they had that we've seen a million times before, or just make stuff up when there's so much great real research and background to be done that resonates culturally. And a lot of the history of occultism is actually pulled from Jewish mysticism. A lot of the reliance on Kabbalah, a lot of the images in the tarot. So when we finally, it may be that kind of thing wasn't connected with or discussed in the room in the way that I'm talking about, but and this is another big spoiler alert for those of you who haven't watched the show, in the realization that where the camera roams around William's room and picks up all the images and all of the essentially research that he did. You have a character in Teen Billy William Wicked who he's a kid and he knows a lot. He's constantly, he actually is in many ways, in each of the challenges they face, he has crucial information. He's deeply studied. And the actual background research in the things that he's deeply studied in has a lot of connection to Judaism and Jewish mysticism. And then we ultimately find out that a lot of this was the product, that one interpretation is that it was the product of his mind, right? And so how did you, how was that, that's a very interesting way to use that character narratively, as the youngest, most theoretically unknowledgeable person being the font of information. And so all of this that connects very specifically, Laura, to what you were talking about in terms of the bar mitzvah, the opening of knowledge that comes from that ritual. And I thought maybe you guys could discuss some of those ideas I just threw out and how you talked about them in the room.
Yeah, me, I'll take the lead. Yeah, I think a lot of the sort of parallels between the Jewish mysticism and, the witchcraft of it all, like a lot of them were kind of happy accidents or felt kind of faded after the fact in a way, which there was a lot about the show that in the end just felt very like, I don't know, kind of witchy. But
Kismet.
yes, exactly. There were I think for us it was really, at least for me, in working on six and kind of exploring him and the foundation of his character, which sort of carries through the rest of it. Um, it was sort of rooted a lot in him asking these questions to figure out who he is. And so I think that when you're unsure of yourself, you're at a young age, you um, spend a lot of time questioning everything. And so I think that curiosity and that learnedness and that sort of like academic nature came from that for Billy. And I think because of that, he ended up with a wealth of knowledge that he could readily pull from. And I think it sort of counterbalanced a lot of these. The rest of his coven, who are all mostly much, 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 much older witches who have known everything just kind of implicitly for a very long time, and have the sort of like they have it in their bones, whereas Billy really had all of this stuff fresh of mind because he's trying to become this thing, and I think it was exciting for us to kind of explore the two sides of that coin, right? Like somebody who has all of this wisdom and then somebody who has all this knowledge.
Yeah, I also will add like this panel would have been great before we wrote Agatha. I'm like I'm like everything like so far that like Jack and Molly have said, I'm like, oh, that would have been good. Damn, we could have used, oh, are you crow's feet in sand? Like, I think
Yeah.
but what's interesting, and I think it's kind of this funny, like cool feedback loop, which is like at least my research for the show was very rooted in what I would call like pagan witchcraft craft. And
Mhm.
to learn from here, like, oh wow, actually that has a lot of roots in Judaic mysticism, but I didn't know that because I feel cheated, like the women Jack spoke of on his podcast. Like, I'm learning that right now in this panel. And so, you know, that's really interesting and really cool. And I think just to also add to what Jason was saying about, you know, Billy's bedroom being filled with all this, the posters and the lore and the books and the this, I do think something that was really important to us was, there's also cultural Judaism. And I think when we were creating the Kaplans, William's parents, we wanted to really love them,
Mhm.
feel familiar to them. They're my favorite characters. Like I like the way Jason wrote them, like makes my heart warm. Like, and I think what we wanted to do was create a home that felt inherently Jewish. And I think for Jason and me, what that means is a home where it's safe to ask questions and to push back and to doubt. Like the Judaism I was raised on was like criticize and push back and be curious. And that's all what the Talmud is. It's a debate, it's a constant debate. So I think that really makes sense when you have a teenager or an adolescent who's like, no, and like their main mantra is no. And so there's that combined with the very Jewish, I think the spine of Judaism in a lot of ways that I was taught is like study, 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 study. It's studential. So Billy being an inherent student also felt very Jewish.
I think
And
too,
yeah,
like speaking to your point about like his parents being safe people or people that were really like open and welcoming, I think like, you know, in the way that Billy develops, like he kind of becomes like the emo goth, like horror nerd kind of kid. And so I think having them be who they were allowed him that freedom to express himself. So, like, to the point of his room being filled with all of these things that kind of make up who he is. Like that feels like because of how he was raised. I guess technically only for the 3 years that he's been with the Kaplans, but that was enough to give him
right.
the space to kind of become himself even further and like, find his way towards all of these things. Like, that was something we talked a lot in the room about, like, similarities between who William was and who Billy is, like what his room looked like before and what his room looked like after the switch, like what remains of him. And so, there was thought of like, well, was William like into horror and all of this stuff, which is where we have like a very witchy themed bar mitzvah and like all of these elements that are sort of parts of both of them that come together. And so I think in the way that the room developed, obviously being a really great way to kind of spell out for the audience, and for us, like how he created this thing and where all these things were referenced, it just became a really, I think, um, clear way to express who he is and who he's become and what's remained of William in Billy's life from before.
I also had, I mean, my interpretation is that he didn't know he was Billy. I mean, he didn't know he was Billy initially.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's in the text. But also, I wondered, in a way, it's almost like it's a form of possession, which is interesting given the conversations we've had
Yeah.
um, and earlier today. And also, did he get any of William's memories when he took over his body? It sort of feels like pragmatically he probably did because he stepped into William's life. Um, and if he didn't know he was Billy, and so was there any sort of discussion of that and how sort of the mechanics of that worked?
Yeah, there was, I think, a quite a good amount of back and forth, and then definitely when breaking the episode, like trying to figure out like a starting point for who he is and what questions are he, asking throughout the episode, and then what he needs to discover and uncover. We if I remember correctly, decided that he doesn't have William's memory. He has no memories of being Billy, of being William. Like we're starting sort of from a very like open slate for him, and he's pretending to have these memories so that he can sort of quell the anxiety of his parents, or who he thinks are his parents, who become his parents. Um, and then figuring it out through sort of context clues, if you will, which is, why the room became an anchor for him and his identity and his personality, and him sort of like finding his way towards himself. Like, I think for my intention and purpose of writing it, like, I think that there's like naturally things that are imprinted again through the environment. And then, like, to Donnie's point about, you know, Judaism being kind of specific to each person, you mostly learn that from your parents. And so I think him being kind of reborn into this family where we have the Kaplans who are like very loving people who are teaching him how to be Jewish in their own way. I think that's what remains of William for Billy is like he fully steps into this kid's life, whether he likes it or not. And
Mhm.
from that, he's gaining his identity and personality in Judaism from his parents, from his surroundings, from whatever additional Jewish holidays they celebrate. And so those are the memories, is sort of, or I guess the new ones that he's making as William, trying to live as this other person and become him. And so, yeah, I think the sort of like spiritual center of that is the family and environment that he's born into, and then the sort of like fingerprints of William left behind, like in his house, in his life, and his friends at school, that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. Um, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you guys so much. I love the show, and there's all kinds of thinking just listening to you. There's a whole other story that could be told about about William slash Billy post transformation and him making his way through that period of time and faking it and not knowing and pretending and hiding the fact that in a secular way he's got amnesia and doesn't remember his entire life. And just thinking about where that could go, it's really the mark of great writing that you could that someone who's just watched the show can extrapolate an entire external storyline from a point of the show and have the world be rich enough to do that.
Yeah, I
And
think
it's a
that's,
testament to what you guys did.
yeah, I mean, thanks, Laura, for the bar mitzvah, couldn't have done it without it.
That's right.
Yeah. But to that point, I think in terms of using like horror tropes and things that like as a horror fan myself, like I just kind of grew up forming my own relationship to narratives and like writing and film and TV through that. The reason I think we were able to create that sort of entire story off screen was by leaning into those sort of moments and like those sort of like, what is that horror movie behind? Like I remember talking a little bit when we realized like, oh, there's a car accident and he replaces him and he moves to his body. Like, I mean, there was like hereditary references and things like that of like very deep, like intense horror movie versions of what it could look like or what that experience is like for him. And so there's sort of a richness in that, in just kind of like writing it from like my own perspective and my own sort of foundation as a writer that was nice to kind of see show up, whether intentional or not, and kind of like plant the seeds for the larger story because there's just these beats that we're so used to seeing kind of happening that kind of like become a shorthand for that narrative for him.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. I think it'll be there's a lot more to talk about in here that we'll hopefully get to in the Q&A. And I'm going to move us on to our next segment, which is now talking about the really scary stuff, which is how to pitch and sell your Jewish horror story. This is we've been inspired and informed by our previous guests. Now we're going to go into sort of the more business side of how these things work. And joining us now are WGA member Jennifer Frazen, who is a writer on the upcoming Spider Noir, a show I'm very excited to see, co-host of the podcast Call Your Monster, which is a Jewish monster podcast, and who recently sold a Jewish horror blind pitch to Sony Television. Joining her, we are delighted to have Nathan Samdal, a producer and executive who spent his career primarily in the horror genre. He started as an assistant at Paramount and ascended through various divisions to vice president at Paramount Players, their genre division that is mostly focused on horror. And when DC Films president Walter Hamada formed 18 Hertz Production, Nathan went with him as an executive and producer. And as of this last week, Nathan has returned to the studio fold as a senior executive at Screen Gems, also a primarily horror division of Sony. Nathan, I'll start with you. As an executive with decades of experience developing horror films, do you perceive Jewish horror as a subgenre or as a particularly distinct area within the larger genre of horror?
Well, yeah, first off, I just wanted to say how inspiring I found this conversation to be. I'm uh, not being Jewish myself. I'm very thankful for Laura and David to invite me on this. I said I would not be offended if they chose someone else, but I very much appreciate that. But I will, because that be coming from hopefully a slightly different perspective, and hopefully it can be helpful to this. So, that being said, in my time as an executive and a producer, and it's been quite a few years on both, and I've worked across different kinds of movies, but primarily in the genre space. I'll be honest, I don't I haven't there hasn't been it hasn't been specifically raised as a subgenre in any of the meetings or conversations that I've been in. I think a lot of the films that we've talked about so far, or that you're going to reference upcoming, I think, I might group generally into a supernatural bucket and sort of assess it in that way, but it hasn't necessarily been branched off in that way. But again, based on this conversation, I think a lot of that is also lack of education on sort of an executive side and otherwise of, not knowing the full background of some of this mythology. For instance, I have gotten multiple Dybbuk box scripts over the years, but, I viewed it in the way of how is this script in a supernatural horror film way, not digging deeper into the mythology and its background. So I'd say that, but I will just say more so than in recent years in the horror genre. And again, I watch everything in this space, and I've been to many, many, many test screenings and heard audience feedback on a variety of films. Like I think audiences now more than ever are really craving a specificity and an authenticity with the characters they're watching and also the worlds that they're operating in. And I think looking to this year, watching Sinners and Weapons and other breakouts, they all speak to this. Even 28 years later, which I love that film, like I think found a amazing way all these years later to take a unique approach to the characters. And I looked at someone like Ray Fiennes' character, who from the trailers you expect to be this sort of generic post-apocalyptic cannibal, and he turns out to be sort of anything but, and provides, in my opinion, the most emotional, cathartic scenes in the film. So to me, again, and I'll circle back to the subgenre in a second, but like to me, it's clear that the kinds of films that were working 10 years ago, and I won't point to specifics, but I don't think they're working to the same degree that they are now. And by that, I think there are certain films that rested solely on scare sequences and jump scares, and that was sort of all you needed to really sell it in the marketplace. And I think right now, to really break out in the market, the film has to fire in all cylinders, and that means a higher level of character, dialogue, emotionality, and specificity. And so to circle back, I do think, especially given this conversation, it creates a amazing opportunity for a film steeped in Jewish mythology to break out like never before, because I do think audiences would love something specific to that world. But again, that features the level of scares and commercial horror filmmaking that perhaps some of the films that you'll reference in this conversation have not maybe had the benefit of. But again, all this to say, whether it's this subgenre or any other subgenre, I don't think a movie in this space would break out based on mythology alone. I think that helps to lend itself to certain iconic imagery, but I think the script also needs to deliver on a scare level and a character level, and be paired, of course, with the filmmaker who wants to do those elements justice on screen.
Absolutely, absolutely. Jen, welcome. Thank you for being here. You have successfully pitched a Jewish horror pilot to Sony, and you said it was a blind pilot. What can you tell us about both the story and how the Jewish aspects played into the pitch and throughout the blind pilot process?
Yeah, absolutely. So the horror pilot that I brought to them, or I brought to them really as the seed of an idea, which I'll sort of get into that process after, is very, very Jewish at its core. It's about a Hasidic teen girl who's essentially sent to the seminary for troubled Jewish young women in the Catskills. And it becomes clear over the course of the pilot, and ultimately the series, if it had progressed, that not only is this place itself haunted by some dark entity, but there's something very weird and sinister going on with Eliana, the protagonist herself. So she's sort of questioning whether or not she actually is the monster. So I did a lot of folklore deep dives. I wish that I knew Jack and Molly at this time so I could pepper them with questions. And I wanted to draw on a lot of, some familiar folklore. So Divukim, Lilith plays a very central role in this pilot, but also Ibrahim, that sort of benevolent possession that Jack was talking about, this idea from Kabbalah of reincarnation and Gilgulim, or people sort of bringing trauma from a past life into future incarnations and wrestling with intergenerational trauma in that way. So it was very Jewish, but also I think that there was, I was trying to make it accessible enough for anybody else too. So much of it is about being a young woman and sort of female rage. So much of it is about feeling like an outcast and trying to find your place in the world. And also the main character is deeply grappling with her own mental health. She's like deeply, deeply anxious, which is something I can draw on from my own life, and also grappling with her sexuality. So I wanted to make sure there was sort of something in it for everybody. As far as the process itself, it was sort of a unique process. I was part of the inaugural class of the Sony Pictures TV Diverse Writers Fellowship back in 2021. And at the end of that first year, several of us were chosen to move forward and do this blind pilot deal with Sony TV, which was an incredible, incredible opportunity. This idea, naturally, as it always goes, was sort of the least baked idea that I brought them. And they said, that one. We have been looking for something horror. This is a unique viewpoint. We really like this. So spent on and off over about 4 years, really. The strike obviously broke things up a little bit. It was an ongoing process of sort of fleshing out this idea. The strategy pivoted a few times. I think the executives, I loved that they gave me the freedom to run with this kind of bonkers Jewish horror idea, but there was a lot of lore that they weren't familiar with. So there was sort of a back and forth about whether we should take it out as a pitch without a pilot attached, or if I should write the pilot first. Essentially, we ended up sort of circling all the way back around. I had written a pilot, I wrote a pitch. They decided this lore is pretty nuanced. Why don't you just write the pilot? So that's where we ended up landing. And even in terms of the folklore, we bounced around quite a bit. I started with Lilith as a central part of the pilot, and the execs actually feared that Lilith wasn't Jewish enough, even though Lilith is a pretty, I mean, we were sort of just talking about this before everybody joined. Lilith is pretty core to Jewish folklore and mythology, and sort of goes back to scripture and everything. But she is also a figure who has factors into Christian mythology. You can even look back to ancient Sumeria, and there are versions of her. Anyway, that's all to say. I love Lilith, and I could ramble about her endlessly. But we took her out, and then we ended up deciding to bring her back in. So there was a lot of back and forth with this particular project. Ultimately, we reached an agreement. We found a version of the folklore that everybody was comfortable with. I wrote the pilot. Unfortunately, it did not move forward beyond that stage, but it was like such a blast getting paid to write this really kind of crazy, very, very Jewish thing for a studio. And also kind of the cool thing about it being IP that's really public domain and belongs to all of us is, hopefully I can do something with Lilith down the line.
Absolutely. It's a shame that the rights don't revert back to you at some point, since they're not going to use it. One of the questions that I wanted to talk about with both of you is this question of the perception of market for this kind of story. And I think you touched on some of that in what you were saying, that the idea of is this too specific is there a danger that the people who are making the financial decisions ultimately will perceive this as too much of a niche market, and how to address that, both from your point of view, Jen, as a writer pitching something, and from your point of view, Nathan, as the person receiving the pitch, how to talk about that in the room, and how to forestall or assuage people's concerns about that if they do exist.
Jen, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I mean, from a writer, and I sort of spoke with you about this separately, Laura, beforehand, I think there is sort of this delicate dance of making sure that on one hand, you're assuring the buyer, or you're assuring the producer, the creative partner, that this is accessible, but also that there is so much that even for fellow Jews, as I'm sure everybody on this panel is feeling after hearing about all of these figures that Jack has talked about and Molly talked about, there's so much that we don't know. There's such a deep well to draw from, and there are elements that you see a little bit of that werewolf lore that comes from Jewish werewolf stories. Even you see these elements of Dibukim, but there's so much that people don't know about. And so I think I've found that, really in just geeking out about how much there is there to tell, and also in almost positioning it, like I said before, positioning it as IP in a way. It's public domain. Anybody can talk about this stuff, but there's something there that you're drawing from. There are hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years of stories that you can go back to about any given topic here. So that's sort of what I've strived to do. And again, we're always writing from a place of character, or I try to always write from a place of character. So I think, being Jewish and faith is one part of these characters' lives, but it's not everything they're grappling with, right? Like in this particular pilot, again, as I sort of touched on, she's grappling with, my protagonist, Eliana, is grappling with being a teen girl in a world
Yeah.
that she feels like she doesn't fit into. She's grappling with her sexuality. She's grappling with her mental health. She's grappling with her place in the family and sort of feeling like a black sheep. So there's so much for people to latch onto beyond just being Jewish, I find. And again, like I think too, for me, like obviously I am approaching Jewish stories as a Jew, but there are times where I've been writing about aspects of Judaism that weren't 100% familiar, or didn't 100% align with the way I was raised. I have written about Hasidic characters. For that, I sort of go back to my experience. I actually spent 9 years attending Jewish Hasidic summer camp as a child, and I kind of revert back to the way I perceived the traditions that were a little different from my own, and how my counselors were able to make those accessible to me. So I sort of try and draw on that, as I'm remembering that people reading my scripts probably don't know a lot of what I'm talking about, and that's okay.
Nathan, do you have anything to add from the executive's point of view about how you receive pitches like this?
For sure. I mean, look, again, I think the specificity to mythology is super important. And to me, that's one of the main things I'm looking for whenever I receive a script. But I will say again, and I hate to always harp on scares, but I'll say it again, like I do think in reading scripts or hearing pitches, one thing that often is missing is the focus on those scare sequences, the focus on how do you pair that mythology and represent it in a specific and unique way on screen. Because ultimately, for any marketing department at any studio or any buyer, they're trying to find what is that cool new image that you haven't seen before. And I find very hard to sort of create that magic later on, like unless you see it sort of in that early stage. Like you can always work the sequences more, but it's very helpful. I find when the writers have come in and said, hey, here are two or three of the big sequences that we think are special and unique to this movie. And I look at something like Weapons, which I'll bring up again. Like I thought the marketing for that movie was amazing, and obviously you have this incredible visual of the kids running with their arms out, which by itself was sort of deeply unsettling, and paired with teasing this mystery that would be solved in the movie. But again, all of that I think had very little to do with the witch mythology that the movie's ultimately about, because obviously they didn't want to give it away. But again, having read that Weapons script back when it went out a while ago, like that script is so great, and it has those moments built into the script already at that stage. And again, for me, it's helpful because again, I've gotten so many scripts where the mythology is laid out by the old wise person in the one scene, and you get that scene and it's great, it's good, but then that's sort of it, and the mythology is there, but it's like, what else are you going to do with it, and how are you going to extrapolate that out? And I think ultimately the movie being scary is what's going to get people into the theater, and the specificity of the world and the characters are what they're going to latch onto in the theater and say, wow, this movie was made at a high quality. It wasn't phoned in. It wasn't made by committee. It had a vision behind it. But again, to draw them in the first place, I think you need to really focus on those certain key elements that you're going to probably show in your trailer.
Yes. Well, and in many ways, horror is a genre that is very much a visual filmmaker's genre in some ways more than others, and is about eliciting the fear in the audience. That's what the audience wants to. That's what keeps the audience coming back to horror. Mm-hmm. It's a very specific and dedicated audience that wants to have those emotions. And those emotions are generated by the visual aspects of filmmaking in many ways more than background than explaining the background of a story. I think the craft of the writer is to have those two things be really married, so that one supports the other in a way that makes the project unique. And I think ultimately you're looking for your horror fans are looking for that. One of the things that I love about what we're doing here is that we see so many times the same old things, right? Vampires, werewolves, zombies. There are other ways. It's a shortcut for the audience. There are other ways to elicit the emotions that the horror audience very specifically is looking for. And hopefully we can use, these are very elemental, deep things that are embedded in our culture, these stories, and we can bring them into, and we're almost pre-programmed to be frightened by them. And so hopefully we can bring that in, weave these new stories in, but still serve the essential need of the horror genre at the same time. Mm-hmm. And that to me is the really sort of the crux of what we're talking about here. And so it's, what else can we talk about? Is there, from a marketing point of view, and I guess I would address this to Nathan, from a marketing point of view, would you, if you had a film with these kind of Jewish elements, would that be part of the marketing? Would it be considered detrimental to the marketing in terms of being too narrow? How would you approach something like that?
Well, I'm just starting up at Sony, so I'll see how they operate, and I'll know more there soon. Right. But I will say, personally, I would lean into it because, again, having been to, and I have a couple movies that are coming out top of next year, so I've just been doing a bunch of test screenings, and like again, the audiences just get so annoyed and bored when there's generic elements to the movie and it just feels generic overall. And the more specificity you can get out there, the better. This is a totally separate comparison, but like one of the movies I worked on is a road horror film featuring a couple going on van life for the first time, and they're going cross country, and it's sort of like a supernatural version of The Hitcher, if you will. But like one of the key elements that really stood out for the audiences watching that movie was the van life aspect, and not having seen that represented in the horror genre in a huge way. I think there have been a couple smaller films that have done it, but so to me, that world was so important to really set it apart. And then obviously we've developed quite a few scares within that world, but I think it is really important to lean into those. And again, always this sort of universality through specificity. Like, I think if you can find that great character to go on that journey with, that can still be the eyes of the audience and give you a little bit of that perspective, even if you're not from that background, I think that's really key and important too. I think if all your characters are so insular in that one community or something, I think it might be a little harder unless there's that really relatable touch point. And again, I'm speaking to a broadly appealing commercial wide release movie. So I think that's an important aspect as well.
Well, and that is the nature of horror, is usually to appeal to that wider horror audience rather than a very specific niche. And it heartens me to hear that audiences don't want to see the same things over and over again, and that you get that kind of feedback. I think for all of us who aspire to write something original, that's very good news.
They want to be scared though. If they show up on a Friday night and they're not scared, and you've promised a horror film, they're going to be very angry at you. And I've worked on a couple things that we had to really work it to get it there, because but that you got to deliver on the fundamental promise of a horror film, and then have all these other aspects to it working as well.
It's actually on a certain level of form of, I've always viewed it, the horror film fandom, as in a way a form of addiction, that there's certain very visceral, physical aspects of feeling fear, the biochemical brain interaction of feeling fear, and people get kind of addicted to it. They want their new fix. It used to be back in the days of, before streaming, that you could sell a low budget horror film based on, you could get financing for it based on having the right poster.
Right. Yeah.
Because the perception was that people were going to go into the video rental store for the weekend, and they're going to pull, the horror films off the rack to watch over the weekend, and the only thing they had to go on was what the box looked like.
Yeah.
And if you had the right artwork, and sometimes a certain circle of actors who were popular within horror, people like Jeffrey Combs, for instance, and that kind of thing, you could get money to make your horror film just based on that alone back in those days. And it's because people needed their fix. The people who worked in those video stores knew that. They knew that they were going to get a certain type of person coming in on Friday evening who wanted to spend their weekend feeling scared.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I thought was sort of interesting, and I won't name where because I probably should not have seen this deck that I'm going to talk about, but I recently saw this sort of horror overview deck that they pulled a bunch of viewers, and obviously, when the audience was asked to name one quality of a horror film that was essential to being in it, it was that it was scary. But when they were allowed to name multiple aspects of a horror film and why they wanted to go see a movie, and this is today, scares went down to like number 4 or something like that. Because now, granted, I think there's a general expectation. Yes, they'll get the scary aspect right. But it was interesting because now it's reveals, it's suspense, it's emotionality, it's surprise, all of these things, which again, no wonder why something like Weapons works or Barbarian works, like it has those qualities to it. But it was interesting to see now, and again, I think it's a little bit of a reaction to a long wave of movies that have sort of all fit in the same exact category. And now the audiences are like, I've seen that scare sequence before. Oh, no, it's going to jump over here. It's going to jump over there. And now they want these other things from it. And again, I think that's why this conversation is so helpful, because all this great mythology, I think, can speak directly to giving them something that they haven't seen before. So.
Excellent. That's very good news. Let's throw it back to Jen for our final comments. What advice do you have for writers who want to tell and to pitch their horror stories, and someone who has successfully done that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, first and foremost, as I mentioned before, I think, and of course, as Nathan's been talking about in depth, the way you position it is crucial. Also, doing your homework. There are so many resources out there. And again, like so many of them get it wrong. So I think especially like having a panel like this is so invaluable. I really wish that I had this panel before writing this pilot, because I just feel like I would have had so many more resources at my disposal. But also, and this sort of gets at, I think, what you were both just talking about how audiences are craving the scare factor. My takeaway from that, because I am sappy in this way, and I really love, I really believe that horror is important. It's not only fun, but like it is a really effective tool for, social change. It's a very cathartic, visceral genre. And I think in a way, in the same way that comedy does, it sort of primes the audience for taking away maybe an unexpected message that they weren't expecting to glean from something like this. And there's something so powerful about Jewish horror, particularly in the way that it positions, the monsters not only in Jewish folklore. It's like you have the monsters and that's something to be feared, but there's also the fear of being seen as a monster and the fear of being othered. And so I think really when you start digging into Jewish folklore, as I hope everybody listening to this panel does, I think paying attention to the thematic relevance, not only the cool iconography and imagery and like how fun it is to like see that we have Jewish vampires and werewolves, but finding ways to weave in these really important themes into that work, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. Thank you both so much. It's been just a delight having you here. Really appreciate your time and energy. Let's go to questions. We want to do a short Q&A. Could we, Andrew, add all of the panelists onto the screen at the same time? That would be great if we could do that.
Yeah, absolutely. You actually read my mind on this one.
Okay. Go. Hey, hello everyone. Nice to see you all at once. I thought maybe we have a couple of questions queued up. I thought maybe we could also open it up to, do any of you have any questions you want to ask each other? No? Okay. Looks like, do we want to start with, looks like Patrick has a question, or one of our co-chairs of the committee. Patrick, would you like to join us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my name is Patrick. I co-chair the Jewish Writers Committee with Dan Signer, who's also here, and Leslie Shapira. I just wanted to thank David and Laura for putting together this panel and this entire afternoon. They've been on this for a very long time. They basically put everything together, and they got everybody that you see here on this Zoom. And also want to thank Andrew Aroche, who is our WGA staff liaison, who kind of oversees all of our Zooms. I have one quick thank you and then one question for Molly. The thank you goes to Jason and Laura. I'm not big into horror genre, but as a viewer, I watched Agatha all along with my younger son, who's 11, and of course we watched the Bar Mitzvah episode. And I don't come from the Reform background, but I definitely felt the love in that scene. And it wasn't played, that scene and that entire sequence wasn't played for jokes. It wasn't played for schmaltz or anything like that. It wasn't self-deprecating. It was straight ahead, and it was beautiful. And you could tell how badly the parents wanted a beautiful experience for their son, and you could tell how much the son respected and valued the tradition. And that really is a tribute to both of you. And in a time when we don't really see a lot of genuine Jewish joy, I felt like what you guys and what the show had accomplished was, and I said it to Laura and David when we were talking about this event, what you guys achieved was really probably the most, outside of You're Still Not Married to My Bat Mitzvah, probably the most spectacular, B'nai Mitzvah scene I'd ever seen on screen. And the fact that I got to watch it with my younger son, who will soon, begin taking, Bar Mitzvah lessons, like it was just really, really incredible. And I just really wanted to thank you for that. My question for Molly actually is if you know of any modern day works that are based potentially on Sephardi or Mizrahi spirituality, or Sephardi or Mizrahi traditions. We've talked a lot about ones that are rooted really in the Eastern European tradition or mythology. And I'm just wondering if there was anything that you were aware of recently that came out that was rooted in potentially the Sephardi tradition or Mizrahi tradition. And again, thank everyone for being here.
Sorry, just figuring out how to unmute there. So my research largely does focus on things rooted in European tradition and sort of more Ashkenazi. A really good person to read for this sort of thing would be Elizabeth Schwartz, who I believe has some Sephardic heritage herself, or the work of Alana Gomel. She's an academic who works a lot more in terms of sort of Judaism a lot further east than my own research unfortunately goes. I'm trying to think of anything off the top of my head. I think maybe one of the good ones to look at would be something like Judah, which is an Israeli TV show that creates its own lore. I'm not sure exactly how based in theology and folklore that lore is, but it's just some really interesting, completely unique stuff that is completely divorced from the things that you might see in Hollywood. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a particularly good answer to that one. Sorry.
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. If anyone has any other questions, please add them now. If you can't find the Q&A box, add them to the chat, and we can call, and we'll call on you. The first one is from an anonymous participant, so I can't call on them, so I will just ask the question for them. It says, Jack, can you share the steps of cleansing a room, and is this resource available?
Sure. So it's available right now in one of my podcasts, one of the recent podcasts. We spent an hour doing it, and I actually had a good time putting myself to the test because when I first started answering this question online, I did kind of my own research, and then I found out later that in the 1700s, the Baal Shem Tov was basically asked almost the same question and came up with his list. He's much cooler than I am, so I kind of wanted to see how I did. I did pretty well. I am need to give me if you give me half a second here to find my show notes, I can answer that question. I don't want to keep anybody waiting though. So maybe Laura, if you could go and ask somebody else's question, give me 2 minutes and
Sure.
then come back to me, and I can give you a much better answer on that.
Wonderful. Alexis Krasilovsky, you have a question for us. Do you want to come on screen and voice it yourself?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much to the panelists and the committee and Laura Shapiro for moderating. It's just been so invaluable, this session. My question is, as a writer for hire, what steps can one take to prevent a potentially anti-Semitic producer from distorting negative Jewish characters in a horror film or series in rewrites or whatever?
Does anyone want to tackle that? That's
I have an anecdote, but it's tough. I wouldn't say it was anti-Semitic, and I don't know if this is always like realistic advice. I actually stepped away from a project very early in my career because it was a pilot, like a family crime drama. It was actually the script that got me signed and like a script that's done a lot for me, and I'm very grateful to it. And there was a moment where we paired up with a production company and we'd signed the shopping agreement and everything. I think maybe we hadn't even signed it yet, thankfully. So I was able to step away. It was very important to this particular story that the family be ultra Orthodox. And it was a very loving, like well-researched depiction, everything. And initially the producers seemed to really like that. And I got my first batch of notes. I was working on those. They reached out to me and said, you know, how are those going? I said, great. They said, okay, so we have a bigger note. What if they were modern Orthodox instead? And they pretty much were pretty honest and said they didn't know, like even visually, how they were going to sell that. And so that was sort of tough. Like that was the first project I'd ever been bringing out in the industry. I didn't really quite know what to do. I tried to write like a very respectful email that was like, this is everything that changes in the story if we do this for every single character. And they said, great, we respect that. We still don't think we can sell it. And so I did end up stepping away, which, you know, was not easy early in my career. And I know that's not always realistic, but I don't know. There was something about it that it just felt like it was removing the heart and soul of the project. So I felt like I needed to walk away from it.
Well, it's also the idea that they felt that they couldn't sell it, which doesn't necessarily, it depends on how you define anti-Semitism, I guess. It doesn't necessarily make them anti-Semitic. It makes it, but it does posit the possibility that they think there is an anti-Semitic audience out there, that they are afraid of offending or don't know, and that's a very difficult I think to address Alexa's question, what steps can one take? Writers don't, I mean, if it's television and you're the showrunner, you've gotten past the pitch process and you do have control. But certainly in features, writers really don't, other than walking away. In the same way that you don't, if you're just in the process of pitching something, even if you would end up being the showrunner if it got picked up, you have to choose who you work with. I think you need to that kind of attitude is going to come out at the beginning of the process. You're going to perceive if they have perceive a difficulty in marketing your project because it is identifiably Jewish, because it's going to come up before they ever make a commitment to spend money on it or buy it. And you have to make decisions about that. I don't think there's what legally, once you sell your project, you don't have legal control over it. You have assigned the copyright, and so ultimately, the only thing that you can do is have real, honest conversation. If they are exhibiting being uncomfortable with how they're going to talk about the Jewishness of the project to the audience at large, the only thing you can do is have real, honest conversations with them about it. And ultimately, they have to have the courage of their convictions. If they made a commitment to buying and putting money into a Jewish project, they should have thought about that before they made that commitment. Or they're not very good at what they do if they didn't think about that before they made that commitment. I see Nathan smiling because that is the truth. You have to, as someone who's worked on both the creative side and the executive side, you have to assess market and finances and all of that in your decision making to even embark upon a project. And if you don't do that adequately, that's you literally bought that problem. And it's so I don't think people for the most part embark on the difficult and long-term financial commitment to a project with the intention of inserting negativity about the culture the project depicts. So I think the answer is you discern that before you make a commitment to work with someone. I think that's the answer to the question. Do we have any other questions? We have someone asking, can all the panelists put their socials and podcasts and share that? And I think we're going to share in an email. Panelists can certainly put it in the chat if you want to. We'll share all the information we have that is approved to share in an email following up. And now I'm going to throw it back to Jack, who has found the appropriate information on his computer, I believe.
I have, and I thank you for bearing with me. I didn't want to like jump into the middle and give a disorganized answer. So my approach to it is anchored and extrapolates from a number of different sources, but it really starts with something called Chanukah Habayit, which is the dedication of the house. There's a ritual in Judaism, particularly in traditional Judaism, that when someone moves into a new house, one of the first things you do is hang a mezuzah on the door and then throw a party and eat, right? This is shocking that Jews would build a thing, but it really plays the basis for how this lore works. So that's the entry point. So part of it is as you go through this process, again, this is traditional Judaism, you're focusing on God and his energy to push out negativity, whether you're thinking about that in terms of the evil eye or shadim or just negative emotions. You start with that idea of pushing out and that God's energy is the ability to push out. You read some Torah. Jews are really big on reading Torah. So a really good example of that is Psalm 30, which is a psalm written by King David to dedicate a house and has a phrase, "Oh Lord, my God, I cried out to you and you healed me." So it's a very good thing to read. Also, while you're reading it, you say Shehakianu, which is a very short prayer that is intended to show appreciation for something very special that's happened that we hope will happen again. So you would say you wouldn't say a Shekianu at a wedding because you hope the people don't get married like that's a good one. But a house is you would say a Shekianu for a house because hey, we might move later. Another good bit of Torah that I recommended to. It turns out in this case, both of the two people who reached out to me were women, and so I recommended Exodus 15:20, which goes, and Miriam the prophetess, sister of Aaron, took timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out with her with tambourines and circle dances. And Miriam answered them, "Sing to the Lord who has triumphed gloriously," and goes on from there. But it's this sense of appreciation and triumph. As I said, hanging a mezuzah, hanging a hamsa. For people who aren't familiar with a hamsa is a it's what's sometimes referred to as an Abrahamic tradition because it is central to parts of Judaism, particularly Sephardic, but also to Islam and to some parts of Christianity. It's very old. It looks like a hand, and it generally has a variety of, depending on who's doing it, blue stones, symbols of fish, other kinds of inscriptions, and that hand is a stopping hand. It's a way to push back against demons or the evil eye. So if that is part of your tradition or it interests you, that's another good thing to hang along with a mezuzah. Placing a bundle of rue. So rue is an herb that in the Sephardic tradition particularly is associated with protection and particularly protection from the evil eye. So it's a good I don't like using the word smudging because that's appropriative of the Native American tradition, but in America, people, what if I say smudging, they'll know exactly what I mean. So that scent and the is a protective scent. Another one which is in a lot of ways just as important, though it seems in some way mundane, is have friends come to visit and have them bring you gifts, in particularly challah, salt, or sugar. Those are the basis of a new and happy home. And having people that you love come and bring those things to you helps create the place from a room or an office or a house into a home because you've brought people that you care about in and they've brought you things that are important to a happy home. And then building off of that, and this really goes back to the Hanukkah Haybayit, is throw a party. Celebrate in Judaism, celebrating Shabbat dinner is a great way to do it, not necessarily critical, but bringing in people, lighting candles, saying blessings, spending time in joyful communion with people that you love. Also, maybe tell stories with each other, maybe study with each other. Do things that are important to you in the house and use that as a way to kind of jumpstart that process. There is a midrash. For people who aren't familiar, a midrash is like a rabbinic commentary, rabbinic story that says that this is one of my favorites, that on Shabbat, two angels will follow you home from the synagogue, a good angel and an evil angel or a negative angel, and they're both going to look to see how well prepared you are for Shabbat. And if you've prepared well, if you prepared your home well, the good angel will say, may your next Shabbat be the same. And if you haven't prepared well, the negative angel will say, may your next Shabbat be the same. Right? Again, that idea is that preparation and that the energy that you put into it helps you get through that next week and as a reflection back on you. So this is the core set of things that I had put together. Oh, and burning incense. In America, Jews don't do incense so much, but historically, incense, going all the way back to the Exodus narrative, incense has been a big important part um, of Judaism. So those are all things, and you can kind of get that theme of creating the house, personalizing it, bringing people that you care about in, and but all doing it with this structure of thinking about God, thinking about the mezuzah, thinking about the hamsa, the roux, this overlay of these material things and thoughts. It's more than just bringing people over, but it's doing it in the right kind of way to kind of help you feel that you've made the place yours and that it will protect you as you go forward. That's the short version. If I expanded on that and talked about the Bell Shemto's version, it gets much cooler and much weirder. But we'll stop with that one. They're like things you do with roosters, and we'll leave that part out for the moment.
That's fantastic. And one of the things that came to mind as you were reading all of that is that that there are many of those things that are very visual and interesting from a filmmaking point of view. Dancing with tambourines and there's a lot of that translates into that can translate into visual cinematic language and be interesting using in the context of screenwriting. So,
and just to echo that, the Baal Shem Tov, the weird stuff gets even better when it starts getting into, putting nails into beams, iron nails, because iron repels demons, and having baskets of salt in strategic places. Like there's a whole place you can go with all of that. But the question was, what did I tell modern Jews in 2025 to do? And I did not suggest they break their lease by putting iron nails into the crossbeams. So
no, only if you're a homeowner and you're prepared
right.
to deal with any damage you might incur from doing that.
Exactly.
Well, I think, let me just double check. I think we have exhausted all of our questions from the audience, and we're at a great point to stop and contemplate all of this. Thank you guys so much for being part of this. This was a really wonderful experience, and after all the work that David and I did on it, to have it finally happen and be this good is really it's really gratifying, and it is this good absolutely because of all of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Laura. Thanks so much for the invitation.
You're welcome. Thank you.